Hey everyone, Erick Stakelbeck here. Today on the Newscast, a Middle East roundup featuring breaking news on Iran, Syria, Russia, Hamas, and Hezbollah. Stick around, you won't want to miss this. Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. In case you haven't heard, we are in the middle of an election season right now in the United States, where I'm coming to you from, and that, along with COVID-19, have dominated the news cycle here over the past several months. And yet, the Middle East never sleeps. Events continue to unfold. The chess pieces continue to move on the board in the world's most strategic, most pivotal, most volatile region. And we've got some breaking news updates for you today from the Middle East, including Iran, Syria, Hamas, Hezbollah, and yes, Russia. Folks, be sure to subscribe to the Watchman News channel right here on YouTube and click the notification bell, because we are bringing you the kind of breaking updates, cutting edge, timely information that you just won't hear anywhere else. Certainly not in the mainstream media. The next few items I'm going to share with you, you're not going to hear in the MSM, but you will hear them right here. And folks, this is important because what happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. Wherever you live, these events will eventually profoundly affect your life. Bank on it. Okay, let's get into it. Let's start up north to Israel's north, and then we'll wind up down south. But first, up north, which is a region we've been talking a whole lot about here on the news channel over the past several months, Israel's border with Lebanon and Syria. Now, we told you last week here on the Newscast, you can check it out in our archives here on YouTube, that Israel recently conducted a daring cross-border raid. Israeli special forces crossed over from Israel into Syria in the Golan Heights region and took out 2 Syrian military installations. Now, clearly, this was a message from the Israel Defense Forces to the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, saying, hey, we will not allow you and your allies, the Iranian regime and Hezbollah, to entrench yourselves on the Golan at Israel's doorstep. This is a non-starter for Israel. It's an existential threat. We will not allow you to duplicate in southern Syria on the Golan what you have done in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. It's not going to happen. So we saw this cross-border raid recently. The IDF sent a message, and now another message sent on Tuesday night. Israeli jets reportedly, Israel won't claim responsibility. That's kind of their MO with these attacks. But reportedly, Israel took out 3 fighters, 3 radical Hezbollah-linked fighters in the Quneitra region of southern Syria. And folks, I've been to the Golan many times on the Israeli side, of course, and you can stare out at Quneitra. It's right in front of you. So these fighters are literally trying to establish a beachhead on Israel's doorstep. Obviously, as I said, a non-starter for the Israel Defense Forces, and they took out reportedly 3 of these Hezbollah-linked fighters. Now, it's interesting, the Israeli Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, was asked about it, and he said, listen, things happen. He didn't claim responsibility. As we know, Israel rarely claims responsibility when these kinds of attacks happen, but you can read between the lines of what Benny Gantz is saying. Look, things happen. Yes, things happen when Iran and Hezbollah, with the full support and approval of the Assad regime, continue to attempt to establish that beachhead, that forward striking base on Israel's border with Syria. Israel has made clear, folks, many times, and we've talked about it here on the news channel, that they will not allow this to happen. It's a non-starter. Yet Iran and Hezbollah, after hundreds, perhaps even thousands of strikes in Syria by the Israel Defense Forces over the past few years, they still don't seem to have gotten the memo. They are hell-bent on establishing that forward base on the Golan, and it makes sense for them to have that line of thinking, folks, because look, they are ideologically driven. Remember, the Iranian regime and Hezbollah, when they talk about wiping Israel off the map, it's not just bluster for domestic consumption. They really, truly believe it, and they are shaping policy and strategy around it. So you will continue to see Iran and Hezbollah attempt to march towards the Golan, towards Israel's border there, and establish that beachhead. But my money is on it not happening, because the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, have made clear they're not going to let it happen. Okay, we're talking Syria, we're talking Iran and Hezbollah, which brings us to some very interesting news involving Russia. Now, we told you here that when Russia entered the Middle East and set up shop in Syria back in September 2015, hard to believe it's already 5 years ago. We told you then, and we're telling you now, they are in Syria. They are in the Middle East to stay. And now we have further evidence of that. The U.S. Naval Institute, which is a very credible outlet, nonpartisan, reported that last week, the Iranian-flagged oil tanker Sama entered the Mediterranean Sea via the Suez Canal. After a few miles, the 900-foot-long ship stopped reporting its position and destination, aka it went dark. Evidence suggests the ship sailed to Syria. Remember, it's an Iranian ship sailing to Syria, escorted by 2 Russian Navy ships, including a destroyer. Now, the piece goes on to say, and we encourage you to check it out. You see the URL there. Russia now maintains a permanent squadron in the Mediterranean based in Tartus, Syria. This includes submarines and large warships. If Moscow decides the Iran-Syria oil run is now a regular mission for the Russian Navy, it's set to complicate enforcement of international sanctions, which could otherwise shut down one of the Syrian regime's vital lifelines, namely their oil industry. So we have the Iranian regime, with the assistance of Russia, skirting international sanctions in order to deliver oil to Syria and to take oil out of Syria. So they are keeping the Syrian economy going. They're keeping the Iranian economy going, which has been bit hard by U.S. sanctions. So what exactly is Russia up to here? Folks, nothing good. Number one, they are in the region to stay. You see the show of force now in the Mediterranean. A permanent base, keyword there, permanent base in Tartus, Syria on the Mediterranean coast. But number two, think about this. I haven't heard anyone bring this up. Here on the newscast, we keep telling you, and rightfully so, about this looming great northern war that's coming, where Israel is going to face off, it's a question not of if but when, with the Iranian regime and their radical allies in Syria and southern Lebanon, chief among them Hezbollah. Eventually the showdown, the day of reckoning is coming. It will be a great northern war. Israel will prevail, but it's not going to be easy. That day is coming. But here's the big question. I think most, even in the mainstream media, realize, wow, things are really heating up to Israel's north. Certainly Israeli officials recognize it. Certainly American officials recognize that that day is, unfortunately, eventually coming because, as we're discussing today, Israel cannot allow this existential threat bent on the destruction of the Jewish state to develop any further in Lebanon, in Syria. It is a no-go, but here's the big question. Think about this, folks. Russia is aligned with Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah in Syria. The piece I just read to you from the U.S. Naval Institute is further proof of that. We have Russian destroyers escorting Iranian ships to Syria. Talk about a perfect storm. But okay, if Russia is aligned with Hezbollah, Iran, and Assad, and this great northern war comes and Israel, really gives it to Hezbollah and the Iranian regime, which they are entitled to do. This is a defensive war, in my view, Israel protecting the existence of their nation. If Israel hits Hezbollah, hits them hard, hits the Iranian regime hard, hits the Assad regime hard, Russia's right there in Syria. It's aligned with these radical forces, shoulder to shoulder on the battlefields of Syria during the Syrian civil war. I suppose they're sharing intelligence and other vital information. What does Russia do? When the Great Northern War comes and Russia still has a presence in Syria, it's still aligned with the radical forces that Israel is going to face off against, what does Russia do? Do they stand pat and watch this all develop? Folks, I think that's an open question. Very interesting. Before we move on to Israel's south, let's make one more pit stop real quick. The FBI had a press conference last night, which was Wednesday, October 21st here in the States, saying that the Iranian regime is attempting to meddle in the U.S. election. We don't have a whole lot of details so far, but apparently the Iranian regime and Russia have been attempting to meddle in the U.S. election to hurt President Trump. Now, that's no surprise, folks. The Trump administration has been very tough on the Iranian regime across many levels, taking out the terror master Qasem Soleimani, sanctioning Iran in a tough way, putting the regime on the ropes economically, also designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps as a terrorist organization, another major move. And this is a move I think that was overlooked a lot, but it has an impact profoundly on the region. The Trump administration recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, that strategic area on the Israel-Syria border that we are discussing so often here, and where this great northern war that's coming will likely unfold around that region. So big moves by the Trump administration, holding the Iranian regime accountable and Russia accountable, by the way. Despite the mainstream media narrative these past few years, the Trump administration has been very tough on the Russian regime as well. So no surprise that these two entities, which are aligned with each other as well, Iran and Russia, are trying to meddle in the U.S. election and hurt President Trump, who has been very tough on them. Okay. We'll have more details on that story, I think, emerging in the days to come. But in the meantime, let's move down south real quick as we wrap up here on the newscast. Hamas, up to no good once again. The Israel Defense Forces this week uncovered a massive terror tunnel dug and built by Hamas. And these tunnels cost millions and millions of dollars to build, by the way, folks. More on that in a second. But a terror tunnel leading from Gaza, where Hamas lives and breathes and rules with an iron fist, into southern Israel. The IDF thankfully uncovered this tunnel before any major damage was done by Hamas. But number one, it just shows you, again, I said earlier, Iran and Hezbollah don't seem to have received the memo. The IDF has sent message after message to tell them to back off, and they keep pushing forward anyway. Folks, same deal with Hamas. Israel, time and time again, has uncovered and destroyed these terror tunnels, has taken out Hamas leaders, has bombed Hamas installations and sites in Gaza, yet they just keep pushing forward relentlessly with their demonic goal of wiping Israel off the map. It's really astounding sometimes. These people just don't stop. The more messages Israel sends, the more they seem to be coming. So Israel, again, sent a message. We know where you are. We know what you're doing. They uncovered this terror tunnel, thank God, before it did any major damage. And Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are major threats. Iran-backed, obviously, with their rocket arsenals as well, terror tunnels, terror kites and balloons we've talked about here in the newscast, how they're sending those as incendiary devices to really light the Israeli agriculture in southern Israel aflame. They continue to be major, I would say, thorns in the side of Israel. And I'm not downgrading them as a threat at all. But when I look at the north and the players up there that we're discussing, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, not to mention Turkey and Russia in Syria, and also we have obviously Hezbollah armed to the teeth in southern Lebanon with their own terror tunnel network coming out of southern Lebanon into Israel. Man, the situation down south, you know, is going to be a very unwelcome and very serious and potentially deadly distraction for Israel as they, in my mind, try to deal with the larger threat to the north. Again, key point here, folks, I am not downplaying the threat to the south at all. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have deadly intent and deadly capabilities. They've shown that again and again, unfortunately, over the years. But they will throw their hats in the ring, I guess I would say, when things break out in a major way up north. And Israel will very likely be fighting on two fronts, to the north and the south. Hey, pray for Israel. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. It's a biblical mandate to do just that. We know the God of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. Everything's going to work out just fine in the end, but there's going to be some hairy moments while we get there. And if you're a Christian especially, you have that biblical mandate to stand with Israel and the Jewish people for such a time as this, because folks, if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. We can be a light and we can stand behind Israel shoulder to shoulder, and Israel needs it. Now more than ever, Israel could use a few good friends. They've got the greatest friend, God above, but they could use a few good friends down here as well. Speaking truth, and speaking truth to the nations. That's what we're trying to do here. Hey, speaking of the nations and Israel being a blessing and a light to the nations, one more quick news nugget that is developing as we come to you here in the newscast. Apparently, Sudan is about to normalize relations with Israel following, obviously, last month, the UAE and Bahrain with the Abraham Accords. Now, the Sudan, another Sunni Arab nation in Africa, is coming to the peace table, apparently, with Israel. Folks, I'm saying it again. Look, we have the Sunni Arab nations and Israel lining up on one side against that Iran axis. Israel will not only be an economic, a technological, scientific, medical blessing to these Sunni Arab nations, but they know that Israel is the strong horse in the region, that Israel will stand strong against that Iran axis, which includes Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Assad regime, and those various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. So we're seeing the sides line up very clearly. There are no gray areas here, folks. Either you're with Israel, you're with God's land, you're with God's people, or you are not. So the wheat is being separated from the tares right now in the Middle East. We live in Bible times. Speaking of the Bible, real quick before I go, remember, we have our Artza box offer. We're partnering with this great organization called Artza. They're putting together these boxes, gift boxes from the Holy Land. Now, if you've never been to Israel, or maybe you've been to Israel once and you haven't been able to get back, or you're a guy like me who's blessed enough to be in Israel on a frequent basis, these boxes are for you. And I say that because, look, this is bringing you a taste of the Holy Land to your doorstep. These are Israeli-made products made by Israeli businesses in Israel, and they're delivered to your doorstep. If you've never been to Israel, this is getting you pretty close to the taste, the smell, the sights, and the feel of the Holy Land. Use the Watchman discount. It's Watchman 15. You see it right there. And go to artzabox.com. Again, I support Artza, and I'm proud to do this partnership with them because they are supporting the Israeli economy. You're supporting Israeli small businesses at a time when they really need it. They've really been hit hard, has Israel, with these COVID-19 lockdowns, and the economy has taken a hit for sure. And for me, this is keeping with a biblical mandate to bless Israel. Genesis 12:3. This really fulfills that for me. So be sure to check out artzabox.com. Take advantage of that Watchman discount offer. It is a seasonal gift box offer right now. Nazareth is being offered, products made and from Nazareth. The next season around Christmas time will be from Bethlehem, which should be great. Then we'll have Jerusalem and Galilee coming up. Very good offer. Take advantage of it. Hey, thanks for joining us today on the Newscast. Until next time, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace.